Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. I want to pick up a question that somebody asked me by email actually some time ago, which has been in my mind along with a bunch of other questions since then. And I bring it to your attention today because it's related to some things we've been looking at in the book of James recently, particularly the theme of self-deception. The question is, how is it possible that Solomon, King Solomon, was enticed to go after so many wives, including foreign wives who turned his heart away from the Lord, when he knew the warnings that had been given to the people of Israel and to her kings in previous generations, and when, we might add, he was supposed to be the wisest of men. And indeed, that's the situation that we're faced with when we're reading our way through 1 Kings. You get from about chapter 3 to chapter 10, and it's mostly about Solomon, and mostly he seems to be being presented in an overwhelmingly positive light. And so, at least on a first reading through, chapter 11 comes like a bolt from the blue. King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, and then there's a list of people from various idolatrous nations around Israel. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. And there's a more detailed 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. Verse 4, "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." So what on earth is going on here? And you do wonder, don't you, how one like Solomon, who after all is such a great leader in so many ways, and in the Bible as a whole is depicted as a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ, how could he of all people have been deceived into such foolishness? Well, there's a couple of thoughts that emerge from the text here, and I want to just draw your attention to them because I think they may help us with this issue of self-deception that, as I've mentioned, we've seen a few times in the book of James. The first is a point which is highlighted by Dale Ralph Davis in his very readable commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings. It's in chapter 11, verse 4, when in my Bible it reads, "When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods." Dale Ralph Davis suggests that the right reading of the Hebrew tenses there is something a bit more like, "When Solomon was old, his wives had turned away his heart after other gods." And that's interesting, because if that's right, and I think it may be, just knowing Dale Ralph Davis a little bit, and the kind of way that Hebrew expresses sequence and so on, if that's right, then what it's indicating is not suddenly Solomon got old, and then all at once these 700 wives and 300 concubines turned his heart away from faithfulness to Yahweh towards the worship of their various tribal deities and other idols. That's not what happened. It's more, by the time Solomon was old, his wives had done this. In other words, it's the accumulation of a long, slow process over many, many decades. And that's the first thought about how a man who was so wise and in many ways so godly could have been so foolish. Gradually, over time, step by step, he allowed himself to be deceived into thinking, well, you know, I did this much, maybe this much won't make any difference, maybe a step further. But the world doesn't seem to have ended, maybe a step further. In other words, he perhaps inferred from the security of his position and the fact that nothing cataclysmic seemed to have gone wrong yet, that over time, gradually, he can just let this slide, and so slide it did. That's the first thought, and that's the first thing for us to watch out for, isn't it, when it comes to self-deception, that we don't allow the devil to get a foothold and gradually reshape our perspective, ever so subtly, so that we turn away from the Lord. The second thought is, as I mentioned, chapters 3 to 10 of 1 Kings are pretty positive about Solomon, but they're not entirely positive. There are some hints earlier, particularly in chapter 9 as it happens, that suggest that Solomon was letting things slide in terms of his personal commitment to the Lord's ways sometime before the end of his life. Here we find a record of Pharaoh's daughter going up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. A little strange. What's Pharaoh's daughter doing being treated in such a way by the king of Israel. There are scattered throughout these chapters mentions of slaves that Solomon had drafted from various peoples. In chapter 9, it doesn't look like Israelites who are being enslaved, but earlier it does. And one wonders what's going on there, whether that's really the heart of a wise and godly king. And then at the end of chapter 9, you notice mention of a great fleet of ships and what they brought back to King Solomon. It says they went to Ophir and they brought back from there gold, 420 talents, and they brought it to King Solomon. So gold, at least one foreign dignitary. There's mention here of a great number of horses earlier in the book of 1 Kings. Horses, gold. What's going on here, and how is it reflected in what a king ought to do according to the law of Moses? Well, you'll know where we're going with this. Deuteronomy 17 gives some fairly strict guidelines, doesn't it? The laws concerning Israel's kings are pretty clear. That the king must be one that the Lord God will choose. Well, that's fine. He'd chosen David and his son Solomon. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself. Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So, horses, silver and gold, wives. Excess of all those things is forbidden to the kings of Israel. So when you're reading through the book of 1 Kings for the second or third time, you start to notice the abundance of horses. You start to notice the abundance of gold. Maybe the abundance of wives in chapter 11 is not such a surprise. And that's the second hint that might be helpful for us when it comes to thinking about how our hearts might be deceived. We could be deceived in one area dramatically, cataclysmically, ruinously, after having been deceived in little ways in other areas, especially areas where, well, you can easily imagine how in the eyes of the world that might be excusable. A king has got to have horses, right? He's got to have an army. A king has got to have gold. He's got to decorate the temple. He has a palace to furnish and so on. There are sins and infidelities which might appear, though they're not, might appear somewhat more excusable, which in Solomon's case paved the way for this cataclysmic and ruinous many wives failure, which certainly was not. And nobody could have kidded themselves by the end of Solomon's life, by the time we get to chapter 11, that he'd been an unfaithful man. Maybe that's something for us to bear in mind as well. Both the long-term, gradual, step-by-step danger of temptation and self-deception, and the fact that self-deception in one area of life might easily lead to self-deception in many others. So that, I think, is partly what's going on with Solomon and his many wives, and how this wise man's heart was apparently so readily turned away from the Lord's clear word. May it not be so with us. The Lord bless you. Bye for now.